Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Xu Qinduo. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called the death of dozens of civilians in an airstrike in the southern Gaza city of Rafah a tragic mistake, which has drawn strong international condemnation. This took place as Israel is under growing pressure as three more European countries announcing their recognition of Palestine as a state, and the International Court of Justice ordered the country's military to halt its attack in Rafah. So what does the increasing isolation mean to Israel? And how likely will Israel stop the offensive at Rafah? And will international pressure help end the conflict? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a quick look at the latest developments of the Gaza conflict.
Hope is the key word for some European countries. Ireland, Norway and Spain on Tuesday formally recognized Palestine as a sovereign state, joining about three-quarters of UN members. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Mustafa welcomed the move on Sunday in Brussels.
Three European countries made very important, courageous decisions to recognize the state of Palestine. And it comes only a week after 143 other countries voted in the United Nations General Assembly to say that Palestine is ready for statehood and it's time to recognize Palestine.
With Slovenia, Malta and other nations following suit, CGTN hit the streets of Ireland and Norway to hear some reactions.
I think it's great. I think it should have happened sooner. And symbolically, it's obviously very good. How much actual significance it'll have, I don't know. But I think it does build kind of international pressure, and it does put a bit of pressure on America and stuff. So no, really good. Really happy with that.
The Israelis have a right to exist, but also the Palestinian people has a right to exist.
Israel has recalled ambassadors and said these three countries are rewarding Hamas for the October attacks. Many leaders hope a wave of recognition might build momentum towards a truce and peace talks in Gaza. Those hopes took a step back over the weekend when Hamas launched long-range rockets at Tel Aviv and Israel responded with a deadly missile attack on a Rafah refugee camp, killing dozens. But what it has done is brought the conversation on a two-state solution to the fore internationally. Alone, countries like Norway, Ireland, Malta and Spain might not be geopolitical giants, but together these declarations have garnered an awful lot of attention, forcing much bigger players to clarify their position. Germany is the second biggest supplier of arms to Israel after the United States, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz says a negotiated two-state solution is necessary. But, like France, believes that now is not the right time. Views shared by US President Biden. Irish Taoiseach or Prime Minister Simon Harris insisted that there is never a wrong time to do the right thing. Ken Brown, CGTN, Madrid.
Well, joining me today are Josef Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at East China Normal University, Dr. Gao Luft, Co-Director of Institute for the Analysis of Global Security, and Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor at European Policy Center in Brussels. Welcome to Dialogue. So Gao, I will start with you. You are in Israel, so now we have this tragic accident, as said by Prime Minister Netanyahu. At least 45 people were killed, civilians, and they are, in a sense, they are refugees because they are displaced from other parts of the Gaza Strip there. And at the same time, we have report like Hamas launched rockets into Tel Aviv for several months, the first time. What's your response to the more recent development? Of course, there's global condemnation from France, from Germany, from the UN Secretary General, etc. So the pressure is piling up on Israel.
The pressure has been piling up for a long time. Israel has been dreading a moment like this because its whole game plan was to convince the world that it can operate in Rafah without causing such incidents. And yesterday, due to this tragic mistake, they were proven wrong, that it's very hard to operate in such a dense urban population environment. If you look at the specifics of the incident, you see that they were targeting two Hamas leaders with rather small and very accurate weapons, but one of the missiles ricochet.
Well, it seems there's
small oil
a
depot.
connection issue, Gao. Let's switch to Professor Mahoney. Will such a strong response in the international community in any way affect Israel, their offensive plan at Rafah?
Well, we have heard, as Gal was saying, that certainly the pressure has been building, and certainly Israel has to take into consideration the diplomatic cost and whether or not there's a tipping point in international political opinion that would ultimately undermine their overall strategic goals of securing statehood and recognition and maintaining those over the long term. We've seen this both in terms of the outrage directed at this mishap, but the outrage directed at several others, and certainly what we've seen with, as you noted, the three countries and others in Europe that are moving towards recognizing Palestine, as well as the developments we've seen at the ICJ.
Cameron, if you look at the recent development, basically every country, I think most of them at least, is against this Rafah offensive military operation, including Washington. Do you think Washington is also under pressure? Plus this recent recognition of Palestine as a state by 3 European countries.
I think that Washington is under pressure. I think that America is the only country that can really put pressure on Israel. And Biden has to draw a line here between the young people who are increasingly skeptical of the Democrat approach and the older traditional voters who are obviously in favor of unconditional support for Israel. So that's the dilemma Biden is in. But the problem for the Europeans is that they have traditionally been much more divided on this issue. And even with 3 more countries today announcing they will recognize Palestine, it still means a majority of the member states do not. And they believe that it's better to wait and do this all together. This is certainly the position of Germany, France, and Belgium at the moment. So Europeans divided and Americans reluctant to put pressure on Israel. It's still not a very good, I think, sign from the international community.
But Mr. Cameron, so what is the bottom line? At which point do you think the European Union or the major European Union members like Germany, like France, they will do something to put more pressure on Israel?
Well, they had a discussion for the first time on possible sanctions. They might well come to the decision to suspend the EU and Israel Association Agreement, which allows Israel to export its goods cheaper into the EU. I think that might come about. But you must remember the history. Germany and some other countries, the Czech Republic, Denmark, have always been opposed to any kind of sanctions against Israel for historical reasons. So that's why it's so difficult. I mean, in your own report, when you were talking to citizens in Ireland, Norway, you see their governments were responding to pressure from their own domestic public opinion. Well, that domestic public opinion to put pressure on Israel still hasn't risen up to a very high level in Germany, for example.
Well, Gao is back. Please continue. You think this, the killing of 45 civilians in any sense will affect the behavior or the policy even of Israel?
Not really. The main pressure is domestic. We have to understand no degree of international pressure will amount to the same degree of pressure that is put on the Prime Minister with his difficulty in managing this very difficult coalition that he with far-right groups. So I think the domestic pressure is much more influential than the international pressure in terms of directing the future of this war.
Professor Mahoney, of course, we have, as in the video clip shown, right, three more European countries. They recognize the Palestine as a state there. So yes, some diplomatic pressure, some international pressure. What will be the impact in terms of decision making on the side of Israel?
Well, I agree with Gal that although we do see an increase and a steady, slow increase of international pressure, and likewise, as Fraser said, that in some countries that pressure in Europe, for example, in Germany, has not yet reached a tipping point. And I think that the same is largely true in the United States. We have most people who are unhappy with what's happening in Gaza, the overwhelming majority of people under 30 who are really displeased with the Biden administration for supporting Israel, but the over 50 group still very much committed to Israel, even though they don't like what's happening in Gaza. They're very much in favor of supporting the Israeli state. Now, I don't think that we're going to see a significant change as a result of either the ICJ or the three European countries. But again, Tel Aviv does have to constantly take the temperature and see how far they have gone down this path of losing international support, and whether or not it reaches a tipping point where it's better to halt the campaign, to quit or to stop this hemorrhaging of diplomatic support or recognition or evaluation in other countries around the world.
Mr. Cameron, if you compare the situation in European countries and the U.S., do you think there's a similar pattern? People under 30, for example, you see the protests from the U.S. campus to European colleges campus there. Do you think that the younger generation probably is more response more actively toward what's happening in Gaza than, say, their previous generation?
Yes, overwhelmingly, it's the same story. There's an additional factor in some countries like the UK and Belgium, France, where are very substantial Muslim populations. And we saw, for example, in the recent local elections in the UK, and this may well be reciprocated in the national election on 4th July, that where there are very significant Muslim communities, mainly in the north of England, this can affect the vote quite substantially. And Labour, on track probably to be the next government in the UK, lost already significant numbers of votes in Muslim communities. So it's having an effect on domestic politics in Europe, but it's not bubbling up to make any of the main powers in Europe change their policy, although some individual politicians are much more critical now. Annalisa Baerbock, the leader of the Greens in Germany, has become much more critical of Netanyahu in recent weeks than she was before. So the pressure is building up, but it's not yet, as one of the previous speakers says, at a tipping point. And of course, ultimately, it's going to be domestic politics in Israel that is the main factor.
Well, Professor Mahoney, as our reporter said, the recognition by the three European countries, Spain, Ireland, it produced a kind of effect that is, have this international community to refocus on the two-state solution. Is that so? You think that will be a push, basically, for the two-state solution, kind of solution everybody says they are supportive, but somehow is not really changing or making progress on the ground?
Well, I think we've seen this as sort of a fallback position, and certainly people are looking for an alternative to this continuity of violence. But I think if we look at it realistically, and let me be clear, I think it would be marvelous if a two-state solution could emerge credibly. But I don't think many people in Gaza or in Israel really believe that a two-state solution is possible at this time. And certainly, while Norway has made this a key talking point in terms of why they've chosen to recognize Palestine at this time, that they believe that Palestine has reached curiously, at this point in time, the ability to represent itself as a state, which I don't understand the logic of that, why that was true now in this moment of desperation and not a year ago. But nevertheless, my concern is that the two-state solution is an old idea that has not been realized and is less likely to be realized at this point in time. So I'm rather concerned that it's being used as a sort of an idealistic talking point that has very little to do with real politics or what's going on in terms of the larger picture right now.
But the thing is, like, if not two-state solution, is there any possible feasible alternative to solve this problem? Long-standing dispute between Israelis and the Palestinians.
There is clearly a solution. Stop killing people. I think stop building illegal settlements. Stop violating the basic agreements that were put in place, and behave responsibly according to UN resolutions, and let that be a starting point. Now, clearly, you're going to have some bad actors that will try to game the process, that will try to drive it back into conflict. But it's not just what we're seeing in Gaza. It is the illegal settlement building. It's a lot of other issues that have been going on for a long time. It's not simply something going back to October 7th. So we need to draw a line and stop the aggression and stop the oppression of the Palestinian people. And perhaps that will provide an opening for at least not killing each other. And then maybe we can begin to talk about more durable solutions like a two-state solution or some other resolution that actually reflects the political realities of the day.
Well, Mr. Cameron, if you look at European countries or the European Union as a whole, do you think there's a unanimity in terms of like what should be done in terms of a Gaza crisis?
No, I mean, there's an alibi function, which is, yes, we all believe in the two-state solution, but we all believe in motherhood and apple pie. It's an aspiration, but it's getting more and more difficult to realize. Firstly, both sides have very different views on history, going back to 1917, the Balfour Declaration, 1948, what happened there, and right up to the present day. So very different historical narratives. Secondly, the expansion of settlements on the West Bank has made it almost impossible to have a functioning Palestinian state. And the fact that the Palestinians are divided between the West Bank and Gaza makes it incredibly difficult. They are not really functioning entities. They're still plagued by corruption, poor government. So it's getting more and more difficult to envisage how you would have a successful two-state solution. But politicians hide behind this mantra now as it's something that they can espouse to the public opinion, saying, well, we support this, without actually putting in any real conceptual thinking as to how it might be achieved. And of course, as long as you've got the current government in Israel, a two-state solution is totally impossible.
Of course, the pressure does not only come from this sovereignty recognition of the Palestine, but also from the legal institutions. For example, ICJ, International Court of Justice, has basically ordered Israel to stop the Rafah offensive. Before that, ICC, International Court of Criminal Court, also, the prosecutor issued this application for arrest warrants for not only Hamas leaders but also Israeli leaders there. So, what kind of challenge or pressure or even a threat to the Israelis, in particular the Israeli government, legally speaking, Mr. Cameron, that to a point may be producing any effects in terms of how they are going to handle, Rafah or the Palestinians?
I don't think it's going to have any immediate effect. I think, as I said, it's domestic politics in Israel that's the key issue. But in terms of international opinion, it will have an impact. I mean, the vast majority of countries around the world, with notable exceptions, including the United States, have not signed up to the ICC. So that you got this reaction from Washington saying this is a terrible decision and even threatening sanctions against the judges and so on. Well, this is, unfortunately, as many commentators have suggested, an example of, American hypocrisy. They want to defend the rules-based international order, and they go around saying this the whole time, And yet when it comes to respect for the ICC or WTO rules, they play by a different game. And many other countries do this too, not just the US. So the ICC is an important moral arbiter, I think, of where things are. But in terms of how it's really going to affect the decisions on the ground or in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, I don't think so.
But Professor Mahoney, if there are these arrest warrants, I mean, at least they will serve as a deterrence in terms of, for example, the international traveling of Israeli leaders. Based on the rules, countries, if they arrive, has this moral duty or responsibility to take action against Israeli leaders.
Well, sometimes there are exceptions to these rules under diplomatic immunity, and these things are sometimes negotiated ahead of time. But, that said, I don't think Netanyahu has any plans to travel to places where he would be poorly received. But to echo what Fraser said, we know that, as we've heard again and again from Israel, that they have little regard for the ICJ or the ICC or even the United Nations. So I agree with him. These developments are unlikely to have any direct impact on the decision makers. Although, again, it does mark an increase in international pressure that Tel Aviv must take into consideration.
What do you think about this U.S. threat or expression of threat, especially from the Congress? Basically, they are going to impose sanctions on the prosecutor and other maybe ICC judges or personnel. Will that come into being, and how will it affect the ICC, the future work of ICC, and also probably the international standing? I mean, if U.S. says ICC arrest warrants is a piece of waste of paper, I mean, so other countries will probably not respect ICC anymore.
Well, to my understanding, senators do not have the power to vote and by themselves impose sanctions on any country. I think that would be something that would require some coordination with the White House, if not if it was coming from Congress, the House of Representatives. Of course, senators are very powerful people, and they can bring this to the fore. But I think for the most part, it's political posturing in a very contentious political year in the United States.
But it's not the first time they did it. A few years back. With sanctions on ICC. Professor Mahoney.
Well, I don't think that Biden wants that fight. Maybe the previous occupant of the White House, or maybe the next one, would welcome it. But I think Biden understands that he has compromised himself with his own base, and certainly compromised the moral high ground that he was asserting vis-a-vis his criticisms of Beijing and Moscow, as we've heard in a lot of European media. So I don't think that this is a fight that the White House wants. But at the same time, the White House is not going to respect these institutions on this matter either.
So, I mean, of course, there's an issue of as Mr. Cameron mentioned about respecting rules-based international order, or respecting the rules. So the U.S. is playing a leading role, basically, in breaking those rules.
Well, indeed, but this is something that has, I think you pick a moment in time, go back to the illegal invasion of Iraq, which perpetrated a fraud on the UN Security Council. Look at many other events where the United States has broken agreements, for example, the Paris Agreement, or where the U.S. has abandoned effectively meaningful support for the WTO, as Fraser noted. So, I don't know that the U.S. is really the exemplar of a rules-based international order, but I think, as most experts would describe, has functioned rather classically as a hegemon.
Mr. Cameron, of course, at this point of time, there are reports like the Israeli side has put forward a new peace plan. Some say there's little new in that plan, but anyway, there are efforts, ongoing bring the two sides together to reach a sort of compromise to finally, achieve a sort of a ceasefire, release of hostages, probably the stop of the offensive there. You think there's any possibility of reaching that kind of ceasefire, that kind of a compromise?
Well, if domestic opinion in Israel continues on the current track, I think they are putting pressure on to try and negotiate a ceasefire. I mean, there's obviously a lot of support for a military operation, but as many experts have said in America and elsewhere, what's the end game? You can never eradicate Hamas completely. And what are you going to do with the civilian population? I mean, the current destruction that's going on in Gaza is simply going to be a breeding ground for more terrorists perhaps in the future. So unless you've got a political plan to follow up on the military, then you're not going to actually achieve your goals. So that's the real dilemma. I think Netanyahu probably understands this, but he's been forced into continuing, partly, I think he believes it himself, but certainly by the pressure from the right wing. And of course, as long as the war is going on, he feels more comfortable that he's not going to be facing any more charges, because as soon as the war is over, the government will fall, and he might well be back in facing charges again.
So you are seeing, besides his personal political gains, he doesn't have, the Prime Minister of Israel does not have a long-term plan. For example, after the military operation, what's going to happen?
Well, the Americans have been pushing this for ages. What's the plan? The Pentagon have been saying, we've got experience of this. We've gone into places. It's easy to actually do the military part, but then how do you get out? And what's going to be the follow-up? And so far, Netanyahu's not been able to come up with any answers.
Well, Professor Mahoney, final words, 1 minute. So what do you foresee in the near future?
Well, I think that unfortunately we're going to continue to see this slow grind. I think there's, some misplaced optimism that we might see a resumption of negotiations that could deliver a ceasefire. But until we see a clear sense of direction or a change of direction from the White House, or some even bigger tragedy than we've already seen that finally convinces Tel Aviv that this is a dead end, I don't think that we'll see a big change.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.